The desert sun beat down mercilessly on Edwards Air Force Base as Technical Sergeant Rachel Hayes stood beside her forgotten C-130 Hercules, watching the brass polish their egos for the cameras. The aircraft behind her calcined Juliet 5 looked like it had survived too many wars and too many budget cuts. Its faded gray paint told stories nobody wanted to hear anymore. Rachel's hands were already stained with grease from the morning's pre-flight checks, her olive drab uniform wrinkled from real work, while the officers around the briefing table wore crisp dress blues that had never seen a cargo bay. She held a meticulously hand-drawn terrain map, every contour line traced with the precision of someone who understood that lives depended on accuracy. Major Julian Harrow commanded the briefing like he was addressing a board of directors, rather than planning a critical supply drop. His uniform was immaculate, his confidence absolute, and his knowledge of the actual terrain Rachel knew dangerously incomplete. Beside him, Captain Victoria Knox adjusted her tablet, more interested in documenting the moment for her social media than understanding the mission. "We're not revising mission doctrine based on sketches, technician," Major Harrow declared without even looking at Rachel's map when she approached. His voice carried across the tarmac with practiced authority. "Our satellite imagery and computer models have this covered." Captain Derek Stone, leaning against a fuel pallet with calculated nonchalance, grinned at his audience. "What's next? We navigate by reading tea leaves?" The laughter that followed was sharp and exclusionary, exactly what he'd intended. Victoria Knox didn't laugh outright, but Rachel caught her snapping a photo and typing something on her phone. Within minutes, she knew there would be a social media post about wannabe pilots trying to brief real aviators. Rachel felt the familiar sting of being dismissed, but she'd learned long ago that emotion was a luxury she couldn't afford. She carefully folded her map, a document that represented weeks of painstaking research, meteorological analysis, and terrain studies that went far beyond what any computer could calculate. The ridgelines in the target valley created wind patterns that shifted hourly thermal currents that could turn a routine drop into a death trap. She'd seen it before. Her mother, Staff Sergeant Linda Hayes, had died in Guatemala when satellite imagery failed to account for similar terrain features. The official report blamed equipment malfunction, but Rachel knew better. The computers had been wrong, and nobody had listened to the ground crew who tried to warn them. As the briefing dispersed and the officers headed toward their air-conditioned command post, Rachel remained beside Juliet 5. The old Hercules might not have been pretty, but she was reliable, more reliable than the egos surrounding this mission. Rachel ran her hand along the aircraft's weathered skin, feeling the scars from 1,000 successful flights that nobody remembered. In her quarters that night, surrounded by hand-drawn charts and meteorological data collected from sources the Air Force computers couldn't access, Rachel continued her real work. She'd been tracking the wind patterns in the target valley for 3 weeks, using everything from old pilot reports to conversations with local weather stations. The computers showed a clear flight path, but Rachel's analysis revealed something entirely different. A narrow corridor between 2 ridges where thermal updrafts created a safe passage that no satellite had ever detected. She traced the route again with her worn grease pencil, the same one her mother had used. The path was there, invisible to technology but clear to anyone who understood how air moved over stone. Tomorrow, when the mission launched, she'd be ready. Whether anyone would listen was another question entirely. The base settled into evening quiet, but Rachel kept working. In her experience, being right wasn't enough. You had to be ready to prove it when everything else failed. And something deep in her gut told her that tomorrow, everything would fail. The mission briefing the next morning felt like watching a train wreck in slow motion. Rachel stood at the back of the command tent, her updated terrain analysis folded in her pocket, as Major Harrow outlined a flight plan that ignored every warning sign she'd documented. "The weather service confirms clear skies and stable winds," Harrow announced to the assembled aircrew. "Computer modeling shows a straightforward approach with minimal risk factors." Rachel stepped forward, her voice steady despite the knot forming in her stomach. "Sir, I have updated meteorological data that suggests..." "Sergeant Hayes." Harrow cut her off without looking up from his tablet. "I didn't ask for input from maintenance personnel. Your job is to keep the aircraft running, not to second-guess mission planning." The sting of being reduced to maintenance personnel hit harder than Rachel expected. She held a degree in atmospheric sciences and had more flight hours as a loadmaster than half the pilots in the room, but to Harrow, she was just another wrench-turner. Captain Stone chuckled from his position near the coffee station. "Maybe we should let the motor pool plan our route while we're at it." His comment drew knowing smiles from several officers who seemed to forget that these same motor pool technicians kept their aircraft airworthy. Captain Knox looked up from her phone long enough to add, "I'm sure Sergeant Hayes means well, but we have actual meteorologists for weather analysis." The dismissal was delivered with a smile that somehow made it worse. Staff Sergeant Mike Bradley, who'd worked with Rachel on dozens of missions, shifted uncomfortably near the exit. He'd seen her work, knew her reputation among the enlisted crews, but speaking up in front of officers required a different kind of courage than fixing broken aircraft. Rachel felt the familiar isolation settling around her like a cold blanket. She'd experienced this before: the closed ranks, the polite dismissals, the systematic exclusion from conversations that affected missions she'd fly. But this time felt different. This time, she could see the disaster approaching with mathematical precision. "Sir," she tried once more, her voice carefully controlled. "The ridge formations in the target area create wind shear patterns that aren't reflected in the satellite data. I documented. That's enough, Sergeant." Harrow's voice carried the finality of absolute authority. "Unless you have official meteorological certification, your observations are just opinions. We deal in facts here, not hunches." The irony wasn't lost on Rachel. Her hunches were based on more rigorous analysis than their computer models, but she lacked the right credentials to be heard. She was caught in a bureaucratic catch-22, too experienced to ignore, not credentialed enough to be taken seriously. As the briefing broke up and crews headed to their aircraft, Rachel walked slowly back to Juliet 5. The old Hercules sat apart from the newer, shinier aircraft, much like Rachel herself. She climbed into the cargo bay and began her pre-flight checks with mechanical precision, her mind racing through contingency plans. Mike Bradley appeared at the rear ramp, glancing around to make sure they were alone. "Your weather analysis is solid, isn't it?" he asked quietly. Rachel nodded, pulling out her folded map. "The computers are reading the terrain wrong. There's a wind corridor here." She pointed to a carefully marked route. "That could save the mission if the primary approach fails." Mike studied the map, recognizing the thoroughness of her work. "You should file a formal report." "With what authority?" Rachel asked bitterly. "I'm just maintenance personnel, remember?" That evening, alone in her quarters, Rachel stared at the official mission photos posted on the base's social media page. There was Major Harrow looking confident beside his aircraft. Captain Knox posed with her flight helmet, Captain Stone giving a thumbs up to the camera. Juliet 5 and her crew were nowhere to be seen. She opened her laptop and began typing a detailed report anyway, documenting every aspect of her terrain analysis. If the mission failed, when it failed, she wanted a record that someone had tried to warn them. She uploaded the document to her personal cloud storage and sent a copy to her former professor at the Air Force Academy, just in case. Outside her window, the desert wind picked up, rattling her trailer with gusts that her instruments measured at 35 knots. According to the official forecast, the wind was supposed to be calm. Rachel made another note in her log. Tomorrow would bring the reckoning she'd been dreading. She just hoped the cost wouldn't be measured in lives. The first C-130 went down in the valley at 08:00 hours. Rachel heard it over the radio chatter leaking from the command. 10 voices tight with controlled panic as the lead aircraft reported losing the cargo drop to unexpected weather conditions. The crate had disappeared into cloud cover that wasn't supposed to exist, landing God knows where in terrain that could kill anyone trying to retrieve it. Telemetry lost, crackled through the speakers. No ground contact, no beacon response. Rachel stood frozen beside Juliet 5, her stomach dropping as she recognized the exact failure mode she'd predicted. The wind shear between the ridges had caught the crate and flung it sideways, just as her calculations had shown it would. The second aircraft held in a holding pattern for 40 minutes before attempting its own drop. Rachel watched through binoculars as it approached the valley, fighting crosswinds that buffeted like a toy. When the pilot finally released his cargo, she could see the crate tumbling in the turbulent air, completely out of control. Crate away ... negative on target. We're seeing heavy rotation, losing visual ... The radio went silent. In the command tent, chaos erupted. Major Harrow stood over his console, jaw clenched as red warning lights blinked across his displays. Captain Stone paced behind him, no longer cocky, his flight suit dark with sweat. Captain Knox sat at her communications station, frantically trying to raise the ground team that was supposed to confirm the drops. Rachel walked to the tent's entrance, her modified terrain map clutched in her hands. She'd spent the night adding even more detail, cross-referencing her wind analysis with reports from the failed drops. She now had a precise route that could deliver the final crate safely if anyone would listen. "Sir," she said, approaching Harrow's station, "I have a flight path that avoids the wind shear zone." Harrow spun around, his face flushed with frustration and embarrassment. "Sergeant Hayes, I don't have time for your amateur cartography right now. We have 2 aircraft down and a mission in jeopardy." "That's exactly why you need to look at this," Rachel pressed, unfolding her map on his console. The failed drops followed the computer-generated route through the primary corridor. There's an alternate path that uses the thermal updrafts instead of fighting them. Captain Stone stepped closer, his earlier dismissiveness replaced by desperate hope. "Let me see that." He studied her markings, his expression gradually changing from skepticism to recognition. "These wind patterns, they match what we saw out there." But Major Harrow wasn't ready to admit his error. "I'm not gambling the last crate on maintenance sergeant's doodles. We'll wait for weather conditions to improve." "The weather won't improve," Rachel said firmly. "It's going to get worse. The afternoon thermals will make that valley impassable by 1400 hours. This is our only window. Our only window is to follow proper procedures," Harrow snapped. "Not chase theories from someone who's never planned a mission in her life." The accusation stung because it was technically true. Rachel had never been given the opportunity to plan a mission, despite her qualifications. She'd been systematically excluded from the planning process, relegated to executing other people's flawed decisions. "You're right," she said quietly, her voice carrying a new edge. "I've never planned a mission, but I've flown more cargo drops than anyone in this tent, and I've been mapping this valley for 3 weeks while you've been trusting computers that can't tell the difference between rocks and clouds." The tent fell silent except for the hum of electronics and the distant sound of wind picking up outside. Every eye was on Rachel, waiting to see if she'd finally crossed the line that would end her career. "Furthermore," she continued, her voice steady despite her racing heart, "I have documentation showing that I attempted to brief this exact scenario yesterday morning. My report is time-stamped and filed with the 412th Operations Group. If this mission fails because of terrain factors I specifically identified, that's going to be very hard to explain to the investigating board. Major Harrow's face went pale. In the age of digital records and accountability, Rachel had just played a card he hadn't expected her to hold. She documented everything, her analysis, her attempts to brief the mission, and their systematic dismissal of her warnings. Captain. Knox looked up from her communication station, understanding dawning in her eyes. The social media posts, she said quietly. The ones making fun of her briefing attempt. They're all time-stamped. The implications hung in the air like smoke. If the mission failed completely, if people died because of ignored warnings, the digital trail would lead directly back to their decision to dismiss Rachel's expertise. Rachel refolded her map and tucked it back into her pocket. Juliet 5 is ready when you are, sir. With or without official approval. She turned and walked out of the tent, leaving them to decide whether their pride was worth more than the mission's success. Behind her, she could hear urgent whispers as the reality of their situation began to sink in. For the first time in her career, Rachel held the cards. The question was whether they'd be smart enough to let her play them. Word of the confrontation spread through the enlisted ranks like wildfire. By noon, Rachel found herself surrounded by a small group of NCOs who'd watched the morning's disasters unfold with growing frustration. Staff Sergeant Mike Bradley was the first to approach her at Juliet 5. That was either brilliant or career. Suicide, he said, but his tone suggested admiration rather than criticism. Maybe both, Rachel admitted, checking the cargo restraints for the third time. But I'm tired of watching preventable failures happen because someone's too proud to listen. Technical Sergeant James Romano, a weatherman with 15 years of experience, appeared at the aircraft's ramp. I pulled the meteorological data you requested, he said, handing her a manila folder. Your analysis is solid. Hell, it's better than what we got from the National Weather Service. Rachel opened the folder, scanning the atmospheric pressure readings and wind velocity measurements that Romano had compiled. The data confirmed every aspect of her terrain analysis, providing official backing for what she'd calculated by hand. Why didn't this make it into the mission briefing? She asked. Romano's expression darkened. I submitted it. Harrow's staff said they'd incorporate it into the final planning, but he gestured toward the valley where 2 aircraft had already failed. Apparently, they knew better. Master Sergeant Lisa Parker, the senior NCO responsible for cargo operations, joined their impromptu meeting. I've been watching this base's mission planning for 5 years, she said bluntly. The officers get the credit, the enlisted get the blame, and the job gets done in spite of the system, not because of it. Rachel felt a surge of validation she hadn't expected. These weren't just sympathetic colleagues. They were experienced professionals who'd reached the same conclusion she had about the institutional problems plaguing their operations. The question is, Parker continued, what are we going to do about it? That evening, they gathered in Rachel's quarters for an unofficial strategy session. Romano brought additional weather data. Bradley contributed maintenance records showing the superior reliability of older aircraft like Juliet 5. And Parker provided operational statistics that painted a damning picture of recent mission failures. Look at this pattern, Parker said, spreading maintenance logs across Rachel's small table. Every major failure in the past year followed the same template. Enlisted personnel identify problems. Officers dismiss concerns, missions fail, investigations blame equipment malfunction. Rachel studied the data, seeing her own experiences reflected in dozens of other cases. We need to document this properly, she said. If we're going to challenge the system, we need to be bulletproof. Romano nodded. I've been keeping unofficial records of every time. My weather briefings were overruled. Want to guess how often the overruling officer was wrong? Let me guess, Bradley said dryly. Every time. Close. 87%. They worked until well past midnight, building a comprehensive case. That went beyond the current mission's problems. What they uncovered was a pattern of institutional negligence that had been hidden by a culture of denial and scapegoating. Rachel's phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. Heard about your briefing. Have information you need. Meet me at building 442 tomorrow at 0600. Come along. A friend. She showed the message to the group. Parker frowned. Building 442 is the old communications center. Been empty for months. Could be a trap, Bradley warned. Harrow might be trying to set you up for something. Rachel stared at the message, weighing the risks. Everything she'd done so far had been within regulations, if barely. Meeting a mysterious contact felt like crossing into dangerous territory. Or it could be someone with information we need, she said finally. I'm going. Romano pulled out his laptop and began typing. Fine, but I'm filing a formal meteorological advisory tonight, recommending against any further drops until weather conditions improve. Time-stamped and submitted through official channels. Parker nodded. And I'm submitting a cargo operations safety report citing equipment readiness concerns with the newer aircraft. All completely legitimate and properly documented. Bradley grinned. And I'm updating the maintenance status on Juliet 5 to mission-ready, optimal configuration. Just in case anyone needs an aircraft that's actually reliable. Rachel looked around at her small group of allies, feeling something she hadn't experienced in years. The power of having people who believed in her competence rather than dismissing it. They were taking risks, putting their careers on the line, to support her challenge to the system. Thank you, she said simply. All of you. Parker stood and began gathering her papers. Don't thank us yet. Thank us when this is over and we've actually changed something. As her friends filed out into the desert night, Rachel stared at the mysterious text message. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new risks, and possibly new allies. For the first time since the mission began, she felt like she had a real chance of success. But first, she had to survive whatever was waiting for her in Building 442. Building 442 stood like a concrete ghost in the pre-dawn darkness, its windows boarded and its parking lot cracked with desert weeds. Rachel approached cautiously, her hand instinctively checking the position of her service weapon. The morning air was still cool, but she could already feel the promise of another scorching day. A figure emerged from the shadows near the building's rear entrance. A woman in civilian clothes who moved with military precision. As she stepped into the pale light, Rachel recognized her. Colonel Diana Voss, the base's deputy commander and a legend among the transport crews. Colonel? Rachel said, snapping to attention despite her confusion. At ease, Sergeant, and keep your voice down. Voss glanced around the empty lot before motioning Rachel to follow her. We need to talk, and it can't be in any official capacity. They entered through a side door that Voss unlocked with a key Rachel was certain she wasn't supposed to have. Inside, the abandoned communications center was a maze of empty equipment racks and dust-covered desks. But Voss navigated it with the confidence of someone who'd spent considerable time here. I've been monitoring your situation, Voss said, settling into a chair beside a table covered with files. Major Harrow's handling of this mission has been ... problematic. Rachel remained standing, uncertain about the protocol for unauthorized meetings with senior officers. Ma'am, I'm not sure I understand. Sit down, Rachel. The use of her first name was startling. 20 years ago, I was where you are now. Different base, different mission, same institutional blindness. I lost good people because commanders prioritized ego over expertise. Voss opened a thick folder and spread its contents across the table. Rachel's eyes widened as she recognized mission reports, weather analyses, and terrain studies dating back years, all documenting the same pattern of ignored warnings and preventable failures that her group had identified the night before. This isn't the first time, Voss continued. It's a systemic problem that's been getting worse as we've become more dependent on automated systems and less willing to trust human expertise. Your mother's death in Guatemala was part of this pattern. The mention of her mother hit Rachel like a physical blow. You knew her? Linda Hayes was one of the best loadmasters I ever worked with. She tried to warn the mission commander about wind conditions that the computers couldn't detect. Sound familiar? Rachel stared at a photograph of her mother standing beside a C-130, young and confident and alive. The official report said equipment malfunction. The official report was a lie. The equipment worked perfectly. The commanders just didn't listen to the people who understood it. Voss's voice carried decades of suppressed anger. I was a captain then, not senior enough to make waves. I promised myself I'd never let it happen again. Why are you telling me this now? Voss pointed to another section of files. Because you're about to face the same choice I did. You can back down, keep your head low, and watch the system continue to fail. Or you can fight back, knowing it might cost you everything. Rachel examined the documents more closely. They showed a deliberate pattern of covering up failures, transferring blame to enlisted personnel, and promoting officers who prioritized appearance over substance. The scope was staggering. This is bigger than just one mission, Rachel said. Much bigger, and it's getting worse. The newer officers are even more disconnected from actual operations than the old ones were. They managed by spreadsheet and PowerPoint, never getting their hands dirty with the real work. Voss pulled out a tablet and showed Rachel a series of emails. These are from yesterday, after your confrontation with Harrow. His superiors are already planning damage control. If this mission fails completely, you'll be blamed for undermining command authority and creating operational confusion. Rachel felt her stomach clench. They're setting me up. They're protecting themselves. Standard operating procedure. Voss leaned forward. But here's what they don't know. I've been documenting everything. Every ignored warning, every scapegoated NCO, every preventable failure. I have a file on this base's operational problems that goes back 5 years. What do you want me to do? Complete the mission. Use your route. Prove your analysis correct. And document everything. I'll handle the political fallout. Voss smiled grimly. It's time someone with enough rank to matter started telling the truth about how this place really operates. Rachel studied the older woman's face, seeing determination tempered by years of frustration. Why now? Why risk? Your career for this? Because I'm retiring in 6 months, and I'm tired of carrying the guilt of my silence. And because you remind me of your mother, too competent to ignore, too honest to play politics. Voss began gathering her files. Linda tried to save lives by speaking up. I failed her by not speaking up louder. I won't make that mistake again. As they prepared to leave the abandoned building, Voss handed Rachel a secure communication device. This links directly to my private system. When you complete the mission successfully, contact me immediately. I'll have everything ready to go public if Harrow tries to retaliate. Rachel pocketed the device, feeling its weight as both a lifeline and a commitment. What if I fail? What if my analysis is wrong? Ben will deal with that honestly, the way we should have been dealing with everything all along. Voss paused. At the door. But you won't fail. Your work is solid, and you have something those computer models don't have. What's that? The wisdom to know what you don't know, and the courage to admit when you're uncertain. That's what real expertise looks like. As Rachel walked back toward the active part of the base, she felt the weight of history pressing down on her shoulders. This wasn't just about completing a mission anymore. It was about breaking a cycle of institutional failure that had claimed her mother's life and countless others. The sun was rising over the desert, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold. In a few hours, she would either vindicate years of careful analysis or face the end of her career. But for the first time since the mission began, she wasn't facing that choice alone. By 1200 hours, the situation in the command tent had deteriorated from tense to desperate. 2 aircraft down, no successful cargo deliveries, and a ground team that was running out of time and supplies. Major Harrow stood over his communications console like a captain watching his ship sink, while his carefully constructed mission plan collapsed around him. Rachel entered the tent carrying a complete mission folder, her hand-drawn terrain analysis backed by Romano's official meteorological data, Parker's cargo calculations, and Bradley's aircraft readiness report. She'd spent the morning transforming her unauthorized research into a package that met every requirement of official military documentation. "Sir," she said, approaching Harrow's station with military precision, "I'm requesting permission to attempt the final drop using an alternate flight path." Harrow looked up from his console, his face showing the strain of the morning's failures. "Sergeant Hayes, we've been through this. With respect, sir, the situation has changed." Rachel placed her folder on his desk and opened it to reveal not sketches and hunches, but professional-grade analysis that rivaled anything produced by the Air Force's Planning Division. "I have a complete mission package, properly documented and officially submitted through appropriate channels." Captain Stone approached the table, his earlier arrogance replaced by professional curiosity. "This is comprehensive," he admitted, scanning the meteorological data. "Romano signed off on the weather analysis?" Technical Sergeant Romano submitted an independent meteorological advisory through official channels this morning, Rachel confirmed. "Master Sergeant Parker has certified the cargo calculations, and Technical Sergeant Bradley has confirmed aircraft readiness for the proposed flight profile." The transformation was subtle but unmistakable. By following proper procedures and gathering official endorsements, Rachel had shifted from a troublesome subordinate to a professional presenting a legitimate operational proposal. The bureaucratic system that had been used to silence her was now working in her favor. Captain Knox looked up from her communication station, where she'd been monitoring increasingly desperate messages from the ground team. "The team leader is reporting critical supply shortages. They need that drop within the next 4 hours, or they'll have to abandon the observation post." Major Harrow studied Rachel's proposal, his jaw working as he wrestled with the implications. Accepting her plan meant admitting that his computer-generated approach had been fundamentally flawed. Rejecting it meant accepting responsibility for a complete mission failure. "Your flight path takes you through terrain that's been classified as too dangerous for operations," he said finally. "The classification was based on incomplete data, sir. My analysis shows a viable corridor that uses natural wind patterns instead of fighting them." Rachel pointed to a specific section of her map. "The thermal updrafts in this valley create a stable flight path between 1400 and 1500 hours. After that, the window closes." Romano entered the tent at that moment, carrying a weather update that Rachel had been waiting for. "Sir, atmospheric conditions are deteriorating rapidly. We have a brief window of stability, but it won't last long." The timing was perfect, not accidental, but the result of careful coordination between Rachel and her allies. They'd been monitoring the weather throughout the morning, waiting for the optimal moment to present their proposal. Harrow looked around the tent at his assembled staff, seeing doubt in their faces where there had once been confidence. The morning's failures had shaken everyone's faith in the original plan, creating an opening that Rachel had been preparing to exploit. "Who's going to fly this mission?" Harrow asked. "I am, sir." Lieutenant Sarah Chun stepped forward from the back of the tent where she'd been quietly observing the proceedings. "I volunteer to pilot this mission using Sergeant Hayes' flight plan." Rachel hadn't expected this development, but she recognized Chun as one of the base's most experienced transport pilots, someone whose endorsement carried real weight. "Lieutenant Chun, you're not scheduled for this mission," Harrow said. "With respect, sir, I'm the only pilot here who's actually flown cargo drops in similar terrain conditions. And I've reviewed Sergeant Hayes' analysis. It's solid." The tent fell silent except for the hum of electronics and the distant sound of wind picking up outside. Rachel could feel the momentum shifting, but she also sensed Harrow's growing desperation. A cornered officer could be more dangerous than an arrogant one. "Sir," she said quietly, "I'm not asking you to approve my plan because I'm right. I'm asking you to approve it because it's the only option we have left that doesn't involve abandoning the mission entirely." That was the key insight Rachel had gained from her conversation with Colonel Voss. Sometimes winning wasn't about proving you were right, but about making the alternative so unacceptable that your opponents had no choice but to accept your solution. Harrow stared at the map for a long moment, then reached for his radio. "Tower, this is Mission Control. We're authorizing one final drop attempt using alternate routing. Aircraft designation Juliet 5, pilot Lieutenant Chen. Flight path as marked on the revised mission plan." The acknowledgement crackled back through the radio, making it official. Rachel felt a surge of victory tempered by the knowledge that the hardest part still lay ahead. She'd won the right to attempt her plan, but now she had to prove it would work. "Sergeant Hayes," Harrow said, his voice carefully neutral, "you'll be the loadmaster for this mission. If your analysis is correct, you'll get the credit. If it's wrong, I understand, sir. Full responsibility." As the tent began to bustle with preparation activity, Rachel caught Chun's eye and nodded her thanks. The pilot responded with a slight smile and a thumbs up, the kind of professional acknowledgement that meant more than any official commendation. In 2 hours, they would find out whether Rachel's months of careful analysis and planning could overcome years of institutional arrogance and neglect. The stakes couldn't be higher, but for the first time since the mission began, she felt ready. Juliet 5 was about to get her moment in the sun. The old Hercules shuddered as it climbed through the turbulent air above the valley, its 4 engines straining against updrafts that would have torn apart the mission's computer-generated flight plan. Lieutenant Sarah Chun gripped the controls with steady hands, her voice calm over the intercom as she followed Rachel's precisely calculated route. "Approaching ridge marker Alpha," Chun announced. "Wind speed increasing to 40 knots. Gusting to 55. Rachel stood in the cargo bay beside the carefully secured supply crate, her hand-drawn map clipped to a clipboard that she'd studied so many times she could navigate by memory. Through the small window, she watched the terrain unfold exactly as her analysis had predicted: rocky ridges, creating wind channels that would either carry them safely to the drop zone or dash them against the valley walls. Banking left to enter the thermal corridor, Chun called out. "Rachel, you're my eyes back there." The aircraft tilted as it rode the rising air currents that Rachel had spent weeks mapping. She felt the familiar surge of warm air lifting them, exactly where her calculations had shown it would be strongest. The computers had seen this area as random turbulence, but Rachel understood it was organized chaos, predictable if you knew how to read the signs. "Thermal peak in 30 seconds, Rachel announced, watching the ridgeline markers align with her map. "Prepare for descent entry." Staff Sergeant Mike Bradley monitored the cargo systems from his position near the ramp controls, his eyes never leaving the readouts that would tell them when the drop zone was optimal. He'd flown dozens of missions with Rachel, but never under conditions like these, where the margin for error was measured in seconds and meters. "Ground team, this is Juliet 5. Chun radioed. "We're beginning our approach. Confirm drop zone. Status." The response crackled back through heavy static. "Juliet 5, this is Ground Team Alpha. Drop zone clear. Wind conditions within acceptable parameters. We have visual on your aircraft." Rachel felt her heart rate spike as they entered the critical phase of the mission. Everything she'd calculated, every wind pattern she'd mapped, every thermal current she'd predicted, it all came down to the next 60 seconds. Entering drop corridor, Chun announced, "Rachel, call it." Rachel pressed her face to the window, watching the landscape below match the mental image she'd carried for weeks. The shadow of Ridge 13 fell across the valley floor inexactly. The pattern she'd expected, creating the visual marker she needed for precise timing. Steady ... steady ... Rachel called, her voice carrying across the cargo bay. "Drop zone, approaching. Bradley, prepare for release." The supply crate loaded with critical communications equipment, medical supplies, and food that would keep. The ground team operational for another week sat, locked in the aircraft's belly like a prayer waiting to be answered. 10 seconds, Rachel announced. 5.4.2. Release. Bradley triggered the drop mechanism with military precision. The crate separated from the aircraft cleanly, its parachute deploying exactly as designed. Rachel watched through the window as it drifted down to the calm air pocket she'd identified. Following the precise trajectory her calculations had mapped. "Beautiful release," Chun called out. "Package is away and tracking true." The radio crackled with the ground team's response. "Juliet 5, we have visual on the package. Descent. Looks perfect. Stand by for confirmation." Those were the longest 30 seconds of Rachel's life. She stood at the window, watching the tiny speck of the parachute descend toward the valley floor, knowing that everything, her career, her credibility, her mother's memory, hung in the balance. Juliet 5. This is Ground Team Alpha. Package. Delivered successfully. Landing zone perfect. Repeat. Mission accomplished. The cargo bay erupted in cheers from Bradley and the other crew members, but Rachel felt only quiet satisfaction. She'd done exactly what she'd set out to do. Prove that careful analysis and human expertise could overcome the limitations of automated systems. Chun's voice came over the intercom, warm with professional respect. "Outstanding work, Rachel." That was navigation by artistry. As Juliet 5 banked toward home, Rachel looked down at her worn map one final time. The pencil lines and hand-drawn contours that had been dismissed as amateur sketches had just accomplished what millions of dollars in computer modeling had failed to achieve. But she knew the real test would come when they landed. Major Harrow and his team would be waiting, and they would have to decide whether to acknowledge her success or find new ways to undermine it. The secure communication device Colonel Voss had given her buzzed against her hip. Rachel pulled it out and typed. A simple message. Package delivered successfully. Mission accomplished. The response came back immediately. Outstanding. Documentation is ready. Well done, Sergeant. As the familiar outline of Edwards Air Force Base appeared on the horizon, Rachel felt a calm sense of completion. She'd proven her point in the most definitive way possible, not through arguments or confrontations, but through results that couldn't be denied or explained away. The old Hercules had carried them home safely, just as she'd known it would. Now it was time to see if the institution she served was ready to learn from its mistakes, or if it would simply find new ways to repeat them. Either way, Rachel Hayes had finally found her voice, and she had no intention of being silenced again. The tarmac at Edwards was crowded with personnel as Juliet 5 touched down, but the atmosphere was markedly different from the morning's chaos. Word of the successful drop had spread quickly through the base communications network, and Rachel could see clusters of enlisted personnel watching from the flight line with expressions that ranged from satisfaction to outright vindication. Major Harrow stood near the command vehicle, his face a carefully composed mask that revealed nothing. Captain Knox held her tablet, but for once, she wasn't taking pictures. Captain Stone paced nearby, his usual swagger replaced by nervous energy that suggested he understood the implications of what had just happened. Lieutenant Chun shut down the engines with professional precision, then turned to Rachel with a grin that spoke volumes. "Sergeant Hayes, that was the smoothest drop I've ever flown in terrain like that. Your analysis was absolutely perfect." Rachel felt the praise wash over her like warm sunlight, but she kept her response measured. The aircraft performed flawlessly. Lieutenant, Juliet 5 deserved a mission that matched her capabilities. As they deplaned, Rachel was surprised to see Colonel Voss approaching across the tarmac. The deputy commander's presence at a routine cargo mission debriefing was unusual enough to draw stares from the assembled personnel. "Sergeant Hayes," Voss said as she approached, her voice carrying across the flight line. "I understand congratulations are in order. Outstanding mission execution." The public acknowledgement from a full colonel was like a bomb going off in the middle of the base's carefully maintained hierarchy. Every officer present understood that Voss was making a statement that went far beyond simple praise for a successful mission. Major Harrow approached the group, his expression carefully neutral. "Colonel Voss, I wasn't expecting you at the debriefing. I make it a point to attend debriefings for missions that demonstrate exceptional problem-solving," Voss replied smoothly. Sergeant Hayes' terrain analysis represents exactly the kind of innovative thinking we need to encourage in our personnel. Rachel watched the exchange with growing understanding. Voss wasn't just protecting her from retaliation, she was using the successful mission as leverage to address the broader institutional problems they discussed. "Sir," Rachel said, addressing Harrow directly, "I'd like to submit a formal after-action report documenting the analytical methods used for today's mission. Other units might benefit from similar approaches to terrain assessment." It was a diplomatic way of saying that her techniques should be incorporated into standard operating procedures, and everyone present understood the implication. What had been dismissed as amateur sketching was now being positioned as advanced methodology. Captain Stone stepped forward, perhaps sensing an opportunity to salvage something from the day's events. "Sergeant Hayes, your weather analysis was more comprehensive than our standard briefing materials. How did you develop that level of detail?" Rachel recognized the question as both an olive branch and a trap. Stone was either genuinely interested in learning from her methods, or he was fishing for information he could use to minimize her achievement later. "I used multiple data sources that aren't typically included in computer modeling," she replied carefully. "Historical weather patterns, local terrain studies, and atmospheric pressure readings from ground stations that aren't connected to the main weather network." Technical Sergeant Romano, who had been standing quietly nearby, stepped forward. Sergeant Hayes also cross-referenced her analysis with meteorological data I'd compiled independently. Her conclusions were consistently supported by official Weather Service measurements. The endorsement from a qualified meteorologist carried significant weight, and Rachel saw several officers exchanging glances that suggested they were beginning to understand the scope of the institutional failure they'd witnessed. Colonel Voss pulled out her own tablet and began reviewing something on the screen. "Sergeant Hayes, I'm looking at your personnel file, and I notice you have a degree in atmospheric sciences from the Air Force Academy. Why wasn't this expertise being utilized in mission planning?" The question hung in the air like smoke from an explosion. Everyone present knew that Rachel's qualifications had been systematically ignored, but having a colonel address it directly made it an official issue that couldn't be swept aside. Major Harrow shifted uncomfortably. Colonel Sergeant Hayes' primary duties are aircraft maintenance and cargo operations. Mission planning is handled by designated personnel with appropriate clearances. I see, Voss replied, her tone suggesting she saw quite a bit more than Harrow intended. And how did that approach work out for today's mission? The silence that followed was deafening. 2 failed drops, millions of dollars in wasted resources, and a ground team that had nearly been abandoned, all because the designated personnel had ignored warnings from someone with the exact expertise needed to prevent the failures. Staff Sergeant Mike Bradley approached the group carrying a folder of documents. Colonel Voss, you might be interested in these maintenance records. They show the operational history of aircraft assigned to today's mission. Juliet 5 has the best reliability rating in the fleet, but she's consistently assigned to secondary missions while newer aircraft get priority assignments. Rachel realized that her allies were systematically dismantling the institutional biases that had nearly caused the mission to fail completely. Bradley was showing that even equipment decisions were based on appearance rather than performance, while Romano had demonstrated that weather expertise was being ignored in favor of automated systems. Captain Knox, who had been unusually quiet throughout the debriefing, finally spoke up. Colonel, I think there may have been some communication issues in our planning process. Perhaps we need to review our procedures for incorporating technical expertise from all relevant personnel. It was a face-saving way of admitting that they'd screwed up, and Rachel recognized it as the beginning of a retreat. Knox was smart, enough to see which way the wind was blowing and position herself accordingly. Colonel Voss closed her tablet and looked around at the assembled group. I think that's an excellent suggestion, Captain Knox. Major Harrow, I'd like you to prepare a comprehensive review of today's mission planning process. Include recommendations for how we can better utilize the expertise available within our personnel, regardless of their primary duty assignments. The order was phrased as a suggestion, but everyone present understood it was anything but optional. Harrow would be forced to conduct an investigation that would inevitably highlight his own failures while recommending changes that would prevent similar problems in the future. Yes, ma'am, Harrow replied, his voice carefully controlled. I'll have a preliminary report ready for your review by tomorrow morning. As the group began to disperse, Voss approached Rachel privately. Outstanding work today, Sergeant. Your mother will be proud. The comment hit Rachel with unexpected emotional force. She'd spent so many years trying to live up to her mother's memory while fighting the same institutional blindness that had contributed to her death. Thank you, Colonel, for everything, Voss smiled. Thank yourself. You did the work, took the risks, and proved your point. I just made sure the right people were paying attention when you did it. As Rachel walked back toward Juliet 5 for the post-flight inspection, she noticed that other personnel were looking at her differently. The dismissive glances and patronizing smiles had been replaced by nods of respect and acknowledgement that felt genuine rather than obligatory. Technical Sergeant Romano fell into step beside her. So what's next? You've proven your methods work, but institutional change takes time. Rachel looked up at the old Hercules, its faded paint somehow looking more dignified in the afternoon light. We keep doing the work, we document everything, and we make sure this never happens again. Master Sergeant Parker approached from the other direction, carrying a stack of official forms. I took the liberty of submitting a recommendation for your promotion to Staff Sergeant. Your personnel file shows you've been eligible for over a year, but somehow the paperwork never got processed. Rachel felt another piece of the puzzle clicking into place. Her stalled promotion hadn't been an oversight. It had been another way of keeping her marginalized within the system. I also submitted a formal commendation for today's mission, Parker continued. Colonel Voss endorsed it personally. As the sun began to set over the desert, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples, Rachel climbed into Juliet 5's cargo bay one final time. The aircraft that had been dismissed as obsolete had proven itself when it mattered most, just as she had. She pulled out her worn map and studied it one last time before folding it carefully and placing it in the aircraft's official mission log. Future crews would find it there, along with a detailed explanation of the analytical methods she'd used. Her mother's grease pencil, worn nearly to the metal, sat in her pocket like a talisman. She'd finally found a way to honor Linda Hayes's memory while forging her own path forward. The institutional changes would come slowly, if they came at all. But Rachel had proven that expertise and determination could overcome arrogance and bureaucracy when the stakes were high enough. She'd found her voice, claimed her place, and demonstrated that being overlooked didn't mean being powerless. As she walked across the tarmac toward her quarters, Rachel heard the sound of jet engines starting up for the evening flight operations. The base continued its mission, but something fundamental had shifted in the way that mission was understood and executed. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new missions, and new opportunities to prove that the best solutions often came from the people closest to the work itself. Rachel Hayes was ready for all of it. For the first time in her career, she wasn't just carrying out someone else's plan. She was helping to write the plans that others would follow. And that made all the difference in the world. The quiet expert had finally found her moment in the sun, and she had no intention of stepping back into the shadows again. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and become a part of our Everyday Life Stories community. Where are you watching from? Drop a comment below. We love hearing from our amazing viewers around the world.